Hello there. We are live, and this is the second episode of Indus Think with Abhivadan. In the first episode, the first one, we had a discussion on decoloniality in Indian diplomacy, Indian foreign policy, and we had Ruchir and Karthik in that last episode. We had a discussion, and we were thinking that we should discuss one more crucial and emerging issue, not just because it is always a politicking issue every week for anyone in the media, but it is also because this must be discussed in a more, I would say, schematic manner, because most of the time it does not happen. So first, let me introduce all the panelists. We have we have some of the friends from the great Indian Twitterati. We have Wakibs at the rate. We have Kartikeya, we have Ruchir, and we have the great Mr. Akshay Aladi. So we are quite going to discuss about uh, how decoloniality and secularism are related in the Indian context, how has it emerged, and why not just scholarship but also a proper, honest discussion is needed. So what will I do is that the format is quite simple. I will be giving a kind of a briefing, and then we will go ahead with the follow-ups. And maybe anybody could start with. I'm already expecting this discussion to go long, so let's see how this goes. So often, the very basic understanding of secularism, which people have discussed, is all about the idea of rapprochement of different cultures, whether host cultures or foreign cultures, and it has been about tolerance per se. But when we see history, we see that realities don't show the way aesthetics have been, and then things just change radically. And I think I don't need to even tell what it is because people understand that. So in that case, what is the purpose of the discussion? So, as I said, we should definitely have honest discussions of how secularism works and does not in India. And when it comes to decoloniality, the Indian version of decoloniality is very different because the Indian version does not generally focus on the generic forms of binaries as everybody focuses in the Latin America or North America per se, or maybe in Europe if necessary or not. So there is a good deal of differentiation there in approach even. So let us start with the discussion. And to start with, I'd open the floor to everyone, but I think we should start with Akshay for a understanding, and then maybe we can have, a roundabout in a clockwise manner. So if Akshay would like to begin with this, so yeah, please go.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. And it's great to be part of this panel in this discussion today. So I'll just share some of my kind of preliminary thoughts. I think the way you framed the discussion, Abhivardhan, was on secularism and decoloniality, right? And in some ways, one could ask the question as to why both of these are related in the first place. I think we need to take a step back from what secularism really is. And what is really the problem statement that we are trying to solve, for which at least my submission would be that secularism is only one potential solution to that problem statement and not necessarily the only one. And the problem statement really is that of how do you ensure harmony in a diverse society, right, where there is like diversity of religious thought, of beliefs and practices, and how do you ensure harmony there. And secularism in many ways, I mean, firstly, just to define the term or at least come up with its three key characteristics, really comes up with a solution to that problem in three parts, right, which is essentially one of neutrality, equality and liberty. So let me just expand upon all three of those. So the first, I mean, concept is like fairly clear, which is that the state itself doesn't have a religion. That's the whole concept of neutrality. So the state is not associated with a religion, and hence the state is neutral. And that's how you that's one of the key ways in which you ensure harmony. The second is really to say religious liberty, which is everyone is free to practice their religion, and hence that is how you kind of ensure harmony, because you're making sure that you are not suppressing people or oppressing people who belong to any particular religious faith. And the third is really equality, which is to say that there is no differentiation in law in how the state looks at each of the people belonging to different faiths or no faith at all, right? And now, I mean, in many ways, one could say that at this level of generality, one can really say that this is fairly unexceptionable, right? Like, why should all three of these seem like fairly sensible principles, and do seem like fairly, I mean, put together, do seem like a good solution to the problem of how to ensure harmony in a diverse society. But I think that there are critiques that one could make of this model at two levels. One is really at the level of one could say an ordinary critique, or the level of specificity, which is to say that okay, if you deep dive into each of these areas, what are the implications of some of these in the context of a society like India, or even globally for that matter. So, for instance, do we really have equality of the law if you have different laws for different religions, right? If especially in civil law, that could be one potential objection that often comes up in discourse in India. A similar such like ordinary critique would be like, how do you deal with something like, let's say, conversions? Is it a part of religious liberty that you have organized conversions or not, right? And these are what I would call ordinary critiques. In other words, where you say that okay, here is a I accept this normative model that these three principles are sound, and I look at deviations from this normative model and how it is practiced in India, and then point out the hypocrisy and kind of bridge the gap. That's what one could call like the ordinary critique of secularism in India, right? And that, for the large part, is what you will see manifested in public debate, which is really I mean, historically in India, it has been the whole secularism versus pseudo secularism, so to speak, debate, right? That's how it generally gets posited. But I think there's an alternative, more foundational critique. So not just an ordinary critique and not at the superficial level, but a foundational critique, which is to say, what is the underlying mental model that one has in the first place to come up with this way of looking at religion and its relationship to the state? Now, is that mental model something that is valid in the Indian context, or is it something that needs to be fundamentally like challenged and critiqued in the Indian context? And as we go on in the discussion, I'll kind of like talk about that foundational critique further. But my submission is that essentially the underlying mental model that kind of informs these three principles of secularism came up in a Christian society, and came up in societies in a European Christian context, where there were competing truth claims of different versions of Christianity or different sects of Christianity. And hence, in that context, this solution of neutrality, equality, and liberty did come about. And many of the underlying mental models through which you derive these principles actually are intelligible only in the context of Christianity and only in the context of a Christian society. And that when you transport that to a society which doesn't have some of those underlying assumptions about what religion is, what its relationship to a state is, that this model fundamentally becomes unintelligible. And a lot of the issues that we see are not just to do with deviation from let's say, the three accepted principles, but to do with these principles themselves being a wrong superstructure which has been transplanted onto a base which has a very different kind of mental conception about what religion and its relationship to the state is. So I think as we go through this discussion, I think we should kind of like look at it at both those levels, which is what is kind of the practice of secularism versus like the broad principles versus the principles themselves per se, and what is the kind of underlying mental model which governs them. Thanks.
That's really interesting. My pleasure. So let's see who wishes to go for a follow up on that, since Akshay has very well, I would say, decorated and presented the basic aspects. So I would like to ask Ruchir or Karthikeya or Kiran. So whosoever wishes to go ahead. Yeah.
Let's just go in an order. It's just
Right.
less
That's what I
confusing.
was thinking. Yeah. Exactly. So let's go with Richard. So yeah, Richard, please.
All right. I think Akshay summarized it brilliantly. All of those points provide the perfect foundation for this conversation, this discussion. And with this in mind, if we look at India after 1947 or after 1950, when the constitution came into force, we can very confidently say that India is not a secular state. It has secular aesthetics. It put it in under dubious circumstances in the 1970s during the emergency into the preamble. But at the time of the framing of the Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar refused to enshrine the word secularism in it, because the British Raj was divided based on religion into Pakistan as a Muslim homeland and into India, or originally into Hindustan as a Hindu homeland. And India was formed not as a secular state, but as a Hindu state, and then under Nehru became a Hindu reformist state. that it took the angle that, oh, it is the state's role to legislate on behalf of the entire Hindu community in personal law. It took the position that it was the state's role to manage Hindu temples on behalf of the community, but not extend any of these to other religions. And this was brought up in the Constitutional Assembly and the debates around the Constitution, and the debates after the promulgation of the Constitution as well in Parliament, that you have invested this much political capital into defining what Hindu personal law is, into taking over the places of worship of the Hindu community. When are you going to do that to other religious communities? For example, Muslims or Christians. And Nehru himself in Parliament said, oh, we can't do that. They're not ready for it yet. Now, what does that mean? That means, oh, the state doesn't have the capacity to actually enforce the rule of law, or that they're scared of a backlash because they think, oh, these people are just like that. You should leave them alone. If you interfere too much, then we can't handle what happens next. So as a result, we have this bizarre form of what's called secularism, but apart from the name, has nothing to do with the concept. We don't have a secular state. You don't have equal rights for equal citizens. We have different sets of rights based on your religious identity, which no other country has. You can have different rights based on ethnic minorities, because ethnicity is not something you can change. But religious identity is something you can change through conversion. So it's completely bizarre and unique to India that minorities are defined on religious basis and are given a separate set of rights, additional rights based on that identity. So what's happening is the state is subsidizing and encouraging conversions to minority religions by creating this vast incentive structure and calling it secularism. But that's not secularism. That is open interference into the personal religious lives and identities of the people. So it's not a secular state. It never has been a secular state. And what's also very interesting is that this whole concept of religious minorities was not defined at the time of the Constitution. It was defined in 1992 when Parliament panicked in light of what was happening at the Ram Janmabhoomi in Ayodhya. And they quickly passed a law saying that it is the prerogative of the executive, so the government of India can notify any community as a minority as it sees fit. And it is only from that date that minorities came to be defined as Muslims, Christians, Sikhs. Jains were not included until 2004, until the Vajpayee government. So this is a very bizarre situation we find ourselves in. And when you look at secularism as it's practiced in other countries, what it means is various different things. In the US, it means the state shall not interfere in the administration of churches and religious communities. In France, it means the state will not collect any information on the religious identity of its citizens. So in France, there are only French citizens. There are no whites, no blacks, no Arabs. There are no Hindus, there's no Muslims, there's no Christians. You're French, full stop. Based on that, you have rights based on your individual worth as a citizen. In Germany, the state collects taxes on behalf of your church or your religious community directly from your paycheck and then redistributes it to each of these religious organizations. In Albania during the Cold War, secularism meant state atheism, where the state took it upon itself to destroy all religion. It took over every monastery, every mosque, every church in the country, and turned it into sports halls and youth clubs. So there's various ways in which secularism works, but the Indian way is unique and uniquely bad and uniquely dysfunctional.
Great. I mean, we have a lot to ponder about that. So I would like to go in the clockwise again, and I would ask Karthikeya to ponder one. Yeah.
So my connection is a bit weird. So if my voice breaks, just let me know. So I'll repeat it. Okay. So I'll like to build on what Akshay highlighted, and then what Richard said. If we see during the 14th, 16th century Europe, the Reformation was going on, and there was this ongoing conflict, religious conflict in Europe about the power of Pope was being challenged, and there was this debate, a metaphysical debate about the existence of God, presence of divine among the people. And this debate was on the background where the European people were trying to try for the global adventures across the world. So colonization and these debates also came along with colonization, and we know that colonization and conversion work together. So when this metaphysical debate was seen in India through their lenses, so they realized in the colonies religion was racialized. So for example, in India, many traditions among the Hindus regard that there's a divine presence among themselves, like the divine is present in earth. And this difference was seen by them as a very primitive form of evolution. So they regarded Indian society as is in a very primitive stage of evolution, and they saw religion and the practices through that lens. And we can see that this thinking is still very much prevalent among the civil service and the other colonial era machinery which we have till now. So for example, we saw that recently there were some rituals which were banned by the Kerala state and in the northeast because they thought it's against public morality. And what public morality are they talk about? So this point was on what Akshay said, that this understanding of secularism was in a society which was very much different from India. For example, in France, there is no equivalent of tithe in India. There is no clergy. We never paid a tax to a clergy. There was no such system. So when you see secularism, it alters the understanding of the native, and this flawed understanding is still very much prevalent in our society, which I think is one of the bad effect of the Westphalian secularism which we have. Now, moving on to what Ruchir said, which was very interesting about the flawed nature of our secularism, is like if we see in modern context, most of our states are divided into three basic kinds primarily. So one is the modern nation state, which is the Westphalian sovereignty. The second is a kind of recent terms, the civilizational state. And the third is the state based on religion, theocracy. So for example, Pakistan, United Kingdom, Iran, etc., Saudi Arabia. So these are theocratic states. Now, if we talk about what is the nature of Indian state, it is based, the structure of the Indian state is like the Westphalian nation state, but what is the characteristic of the state? So what I have noticed, and in my opinion, after independence, the kind of Indian state is being branded as a secular state. Secular state is the biggest characteristic of this country, which has historical basis as well. But if we go to West, we don't hear such words. It is very much a part of our culture, branded as one. So if we talk about this secular state was based upon, the idea was based upon this syncretic culture of the Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, which was told to us, and this was on the background of the partition, where so many persecuted minorities from Pakistan were coming to India. So these minorities were never allowed to actually accept or just reconcile with the fact that what happened to them. This forceful identity was forced upon the country, that there was this mythical unity and brotherhood among the people, and this is how we will work. Now there might be other reasons. I don't blame the constitutional framers that they had some ulterior, with like some different motives. They were like, it's a big diverse country and Pakistan just happened, we need to make a imagined identity, otherwise India will collapse. That might be the reason, but because of this thinking, we have reached a situation where anybody who tries to question this is branded as a Hindu nationalist. While the people of India never got the chance to actually identify what the nature and structure of the country is. Liberté, égalité, fraternité is not Indian, it's French. Our philosophical points, our principles were never included in the constitution. And a great legal theorist, Kelsen and Savigny, they have talked about two very important significant principles, which is the Grundnorm, the German word for a basic norm, and Vogelgeist, that's also German for the public consciousness. So in our constitution, these two basic principles are missing in our society. And Germany, being a fairly recent country, are based upon this imagined identity, and they have been very much successful in that. And we have failed in that. So I think the biggest reason is that biggest problem we face is defining the structure of our constitution and the modern nation state we call India.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, I have just a request. So maybe when I'm just speaking, it's echoing from Kiran's side. So Kiran, if you can just mute, please. So sorry. Yeah, no issues. So just before Kiran goes for a follow-up, just to add, because you have mentioned a very important point, and I think it's becoming like a cone. So from what Akshay said, filtered by what Ruchir said, filtered by what you have said, I think we can understand this aspect that you very well mentioned about the debates in Europe about Catholicism and all that, and what was happening with the Pope, wherein you mentioned that you very well said that the divine, why Indians were said that they were primitive, that the divine was within the earth, according to the Indians, while in Europe, you said that the divine was within the humans, which is about the vox populi thing at the end of the day, how people take it up. Sometimes people even take it in the idea of consequentialism, global consequentialism, or state consequentialism, or maybe religious consequentialism. So I think we can take that part also, and we can discuss that later. But I think that's a good way to start with. So I would now ask Kiran to go ahead. Yeah, please. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, very interesting comments on all these aspects about the structure of the constitution, the historical context of how we got here, and also how it's being implemented in day-to-day contemporary India. I would like to take actually a step back and go to the fundamentals and try to discuss what secularism means. Because if you see, India has the historical context of being freed from the British rule, and we have our constitution. And Britain is not a secular country. So the head of Britain as a British state is the head of the Anglican Church, which is right now Queen Elizabeth. So our country was part of Britain. It was a colony of Britain, and the head of our country was the head of the Anglican Church. And this is not the past. Our jurisprudence, our constitution, actually a large part of our constitution comes from the British Raj, and the jurisprudence still refers to these old judgments. And furthermore, they actually refer to even far beyond sometimes, what in Britain in the Middle Ages, what was discussed. So this is all part of our state apparatus. So a big part of this is not secular. It's full stop. It is basically driven and implemented by a state where the head of the state was the head of the Anglican Church. So that is the state apparatus we have today. Now we have to see actually why we even had the word secular. It is actually, as Ruchir mentioned, inserted into the constitution, into the preamble by Mrs. Indira Gandhi. And there was a historical context for this. And then we have the funny thing which we have in India uniquely, but it shared with other colonized countries, which is that our constitution is not in our language. And that basically imposes the thought process and the vocabulary of English onto, incompetent and incapable minds of Indians, because we don't understand what these mean. Even people who know how to speak English fairly well, including the people on the panel, even us, we may not understand what the words mean, because the words have a history, they have a context in the overall context of the language. And all these words in English in which our constitution is written, we have no clue actually how they come, what do they mean, and the interpretation refers, as I said, to British jurisprudence. Okay, so let's just take a step back, and I would like to just look at the word secular, because you want to understand what secular is, right? So if you look at the etymology and how the word came about, it's very interesting. It comes from astronomy to begin with, and it originally meant a residual, a small error or a small update in astronomical motion to calculate the motion of the stars, and thereby to estimate the start of the year, so the calendar year. And you actually have to look at the stars, the constellations, the planets, and so on. And some of these are fairly regular. They basically go, for example, every year you can expect what comes, and you can model them. And if it may not be for a year, it sometimes might be for 5 years or 100 years. In India, we have the concept of yuga, and the yuga is when everything comes back. So it's like yoking all things together, and then the model keeps rotating. So that's what we very naturally understand as rutam. So ruta is what keeps rotating. So this is what the Europeans also had, in fact, and even the Christian church also has this ideas. Now, what is secular? Secular is basically stuff we don't understand. So things which the model was not able to predict. And one of that was actually the astronomical precession, because things happen, the stars change in location, and if the model is not accurate, some random things occur. And they actually started adding other things like comets. Sometimes, some random strange things happen. And these are considered as bad omens. Any culture, I would not say primitive culture, but any culture would just suddenly, something dramatic happens, like COVID, for example. We just say bad omen, it comes from the whatever is happening. So these kind of things, which our model is not able to predict, and it's a reflection of our ignorance as our society. That was actually the origin of secular. It was used in this sense by scientists. And at some point, it started moving towards public discourse, and people were actually referring to the social aspects of what men do, or what people do in their society, which is sometimes messed up, and it's not like following any order, right? So we need to have some space to breathe out and breathe in, and not everything following according to the rules. So we need that little bit of space, and that. They said it's secular. You just relax. You just don't. You don't have to follow everything according to the Bible or some model. You just need to have a little bit of breathing space. Okay, so this is the origin of how the word secular came about, and slowly started referring to the laxity in politics and how people can actually do other things. And one of the aspects was doing stuff which is not ordered according to the king's decree. The king says something, but you can still do some other stuff. You use some breathing space, and that is how the tradition in Britain through Magna Carta, which was actually a limitation of the king's authority on public life. And then the corresponding evolution in Europe. We have in Germany the giant fight against Rome, against the Catholic Church from Martin Luther, and then they also wanted to have some breathing space, some place to get out and do their thing, just not get always somebody on the head. Now the thing is, this word secular got intensely popular during a specific aspect in European history, and that was the French Revolution. And that is when they basically chopped off the king, right? They just got rid of him, and got rid of a lot of people, actually. It's a disaster in a human sense, and also at the same time, it was a huge revolution in the intellectual sense. A lot of new ideas came about. So the French don't call it secular. The word is, they use it as laïque, laïcité is the word. So they insist that it is actually a little bit different. Richard pointed out. So let me just argue a little bit from the word laïque, because that is we discussed a little bit about secular. Let's just go for laïque. So laïcité, the word exists in English in certain forms as laity. It's actually low people, or people who are not part of the clergy, who are doing their thing. So laik means not clergy. That is basically what it means. And if you look at the etymology of what this word, where it comes from, it's from Greek. And it actually is related to the Sanskrit word loka. Okay, loka is what happens in the world. And in Hindi and in Telugu and in many Indian languages, we have laukika, means what happens in the regular world. We have the paramarthika, sometimes when we refer to experiential or consciousness-based things. We have daivika when we refer to rituals or following certain divine beings, deities, devas. Referring also to astronomy, it's also the adhidayvika sense. But we also have very simple adhibautika or laukika sense. Laukika is what happens in the in a very local area, which is our desha kala samaya, what we do. And interestingly, the word secular in Telugu, my mother tongue, is translated as laukikavadam. So laukika is the word that is used. In Hindi, it's not used. Somehow, we have different interpretations. And when Mrs. Indira Gandhi inserted this word into the constitution, we had to translate it because we have to have at least one functional, copy, not, the master copy, the copy where nobody bothers to look, doesn't have any authority, but, the light, the low people of India need to have a way of understanding. So that is in Hindi. And there was actually a discussion. They said, let's translate it saying dharma nirapeksha or something like that. So which is absurd, completely stupid. Doesn't have any sense to what it means. But at some point, somebody corrected and said, let's say it pantha nirapeksha or mata nirapeksha. I don't remember what exactly the word was. But essentially, it means it should be kind of neutral or tolerant to any specific religion, what Akshay mentioned. And that is how this word secular was translated. So why not laukika? That would have been a great word. It's used in certain languages. It is connected to the Greek etymology, and we haven't used it. Anyway, let's just look at why the French give so much of importance to laicity, right? So I lived in France for in total around 6 years, and basically went through the French culture, absorbed the various happenings that happened during that time. One of the very significant things was the brutal murder of the journalists and cartoonists from Charlie Hebdo, which was a defining moment in French history, I would say French modern history. And that is again to do with this laicite. So why the French are so picky about this word? Because they don't want any, sermonizing from the New York Times or the British. They want to have their thing, and it's very fundamental to their identity. Why? Because they chopped off their king for that. That is why. So the reason is the king is hand in gloves with the clergy, and every system was controlled through these aristocratic means, and the French really had to struggle to get their say and have an impact on the state. They even had a commune in Paris, which was still remembered very fondly by many French people. But the important thing is that during the French Revolution, these values of the commune, these values against the king, and a spirit of equality, definitely influenced by the discourse also in Germany from Martin Luther against the Pope, definitely influenced by the American Revolution, the ideals of Thomas Paine and what is common sense and the Declaration of Independence of the United States. So all these ideas of like allowing democracy and free thought are really, really important. So now, when like we Indians, we just comment about secularism without understanding this historical background, saying that secularism is bad, what we are actually conveying is that we don't like these ideas. We don't like these ideas of democracy, these ideas of equality, freedom, liberty, and so on. Okay? Is it actually making any sense? It's actually, we are using a language which is not our own language. We are borrowing some context which is not our own, and we are getting, hit on by people who don't, give us some, some slack for not, using our own language. So let's just, if we have 5 more minutes, I can explain a little bit about the French background and why they're really so passionate about this laicite. And the French actually have the motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité. So Karthikeya mentioned that. So these are really, really important ideals in the French constitution. Liberté is freedom, right? Freedom to be what you want. And this is how it's interpreted in the Enlightenment values, that you have the freedom to live your life without hurting other people, of course, but also investigate science and do whatever you want and have that. So that is one thing. The second thing is equality, equality, and equality means equality in front of the law. So the king is not separate from the commoner, the clergy is not separate from the laity, and every bit of the law has to be interpreted according to this. Okay, so that is the equality, how it is interpreted in Enlightenment values. And fraternité is actually some kind of a brotherhood. And that means that whatever resources and whatever wealth and capabilities that the nation has, it has to be shared across the citizens, and everybody should be able to prosper and get forward. All great ideas, right? But if we look back and why in France these words have been used, they have a context, and others have mentioned it has a specific Christian context. Originally, the word, and it comes straight from the debates in Europe, for example, from Luther and other Protestant theologians, and also other Christian thinkers. And the words are very deeply Christian, actually. So liberté is related to the concept of free will. Very, very fundamental Christian concept related to from Thomas Aquinas. And what he means by free will is the ability to understand the writ and the law of God and accept it. So this acceptance of the word of Bible is a choice, and a choice a person can take or not take. So this liberty is a very fundamental Christian value. Okay, and actually, from my very neutral, objective opinion, a good value. Okay, so the thing is, this liberty that is inherent in Christian ethic and in Bible, they are arguing as these thinkers, okay, let's extend this concept of liberty and give it a bit more slack, a bit more space for the king, where the king cannot poke his finger. So that is how the word liberty comes around. What is equality? Equality is equality of men. Okay, in the beginning it was just men, no women, but let's just assume it's a human, equality of humans. No animals, no trees, no bacteria, nothing. Okay, it's just, men. Why? Because men can be saved. They can be getting to heaven, and everybody deserves an equal opportunity for that, right? So this equality is again a very fundamental Christian ethic, and it's an equality of not just Christians, but equality of all humans. So they have that ability to get to heaven if they want, if they do their proper thing with the first thing, which is the free will. So point blank dismissing some people saying that they will always be condemned to hell is a very, very anti-Christian thing. And this is how sometimes Hinduism is presented. For ignorant people, they would say that it's just condemning a huge people without even allowing them to look at what the true word is or what God is and so on. Anyway, so this equality has that ethic, and then it has been extended towards equality of men in general law, not just in Christian law, but where you kind of have to interpret the law, and the king cannot be separate from the commoner and so on. So that is another great ideal. The third thing is fraternity, and that is a fraternity of the people of the flock. So the people who are Christians need to hang out and support each other. And that's very, very Christian value. Again, it is a good value. Why not have them support each other and help them, right? And this fraternity concept is again, implemented in many Christian rituals and habits. Charity, for example, is a very important consequence of fraternity. Now, this has been extended towards fraternity of citizens in the whole country, and the French kind of revolution actually borrowed these things. So now you see the words have a Christian origin, but they have been kind of remodeled and reshaped, right? Now let's just take a step back, and I would like to ask, what would be a good Indian value for liberty, a good Indian word or a good Indian equivalent for equality, and a good Indian equivalent for fraternity? Okay, we don't necessarily have to just have this history. We have to look back at our own philosophy and our own ethic We have a long tradition of dharmasastras, itihasas, and so on. So we have a lot of words. So I just thought about it before I got onto this podcast, and I said, okay, from my point of view, right, liberty, when you have complete freedom, that is actually a bit partial to the fact that people are mostly dumb. They don't know what they want. This is a natural consequence, right? So liberty makes sense only when you are smart. You know what you want. You are aware, and this awareness or knowledge would come through study and through self-reflection. So there is a value in Indian system which is swadhyaya, so self-study, and that needs to be done, and the freedom to do that, the freedom to do swadhyaya, okay, swadhyaya svecha, or some swadhyaya sakti, we need to have energy to do that to allow to everybody and not annoy them while they're doing that. That is what we want. In fact, that's what when we just blindly ask an Indian, we would like to have liberty, and they are rooted in the Indian context and dharmic context, they would actually mean this swadhyaya shakti or swadhyaya svecha, and that is what we see when we see the French. We see a universal value which they don't have any idea about. So they didn't have this historical background of swadhyaya, but we interpret it like that, and that is a refinement and universalization of the value. So that is one thing. Then let's look at equality. According to dharmic context, right, equality of just men or equality of humans is actually ignorant. It is wrong. So we are all just jiva. Everything is a jiva. A dog or a cat or a plant, a bacteria. They all have life. They all have some ethic, some dharma, and we need to support that. So that it's not equality, of course. How can you say a bacteria is equal to human or so on? What is the equivalent of such a concept? Okay, so we need to have some way of saying that everybody gives ideas and we need to respect them, and we treat them some sense as equal, so that we give a common start, so that we all can build like some beautiful harmonious society together. So we need something like equality. And we have certain concepts. So for example, Rajiv Malhotra, he keeps saying, let's just not say mutual tolerance, let's say mutual respect. And I think his value is that it's really an Indic dharmic value, and it is actually in Sanskrit or in Indian languages, we call it sanmana. Sanmana is when we respect the good in somebody, and that any person or any being, anything in life, in nature can have that, and that we respect. And even better, we say that even if somebody doesn't have that, somebody is a bit stupid or whatever, he can still get there. He can do something and he get to that state. So we respect the potential of somebody to reach to such a state. So I thought, what would be a good word? I don't know, but one word would be, for example, bhadra sanmana. So bhadra is a very nice Indian word. You can actually, be dirty, but you can make yourself bhadra. You can, take a bath. You can do some kind of a procedure, and at some point you get to that state where you can contribute in some kind of a satsang or sadgoshti, and where you exchange ideas, right? So this point where a person, anywhere, wherever he is, he would be reaching that state, that bhadra state, is a very unique and very Indian value. And I think we expect, when we say equality, I believe that at some point in the back, we feel that, okay, wherever they are, whether he is a Buddha, Jaina, or even a Muslim or a Christian, at some point, he would get to that bhadra state, and that we should respect, that sammanam, that value much we should respect. So that is equality. I think that is a good thing, and why not just also respect that thing in a fish or a cat or a dog? May also show us some divine thing, right? And it is a very Indian thing. In Shaiva system, we people follow. There is a great spider or a great elephant. In Vaishnava system, there is a great elephant. So we need to have that bhadra sanmana to all the jivas, and that I think is a great dharmic value. Let's just see the final thing, the fraternity, right? So in Telugu, we translate it as saubhratrutvam, saubhratrutva. So it's like bhratrutva is fraternity, and saubhratrutva because it's good fraternity. We need to be like even better. But as I said, the concept originally comes from the fraternity of the flock, and it is a bit un-Indian. I would say even un-Indian. It's not undharmic. So we need to have an equivalent for that. And that is actually, again, our respect for differences and diversity in in the nature. And we have a long tradition in Buddhism, in Hinduism, and many other systems where we have such mutual collaboration, and where everybody comes together and a harmonious whole is built. And for example, the Buddha say that this consciousness basically comes from interreflection of all these jivas. Pratitya samutpada. Prati iti, in front of us, is how the samutpada, the thing is getting produced, the reflection, the consciousness, and the divine element. So we are all like trying to kind of build a harmonious whole together. That could be other people, other beings, and even inanimate things. And this all has to be put together. So what would be a good word for that? And I think a really good word is Yogakshemam. And it actually is there in some of the Indian institutions, as I don't remember which one, but yoga is already getting together, like the universe and the individual getting together, the various people in the society getting together. And this yoga is the reason why we have to be practicing yajna. Yajna is how we get to that state. And yajna is interreflected in every activity of human life. It's not just some ritual or something. Everything that we do needs to think of not just ourselves, our own selfish thing, but for everything in the world. So this yoga, and then through this activity, we basically bring kshema to all the beings. So we can call it yoga kshema. If you don't want to make it too complex, we can call it sankshema. And so we need to have some goal like that, which when we see these ideals, we are able to express it properly in our own Indic terminology. And ideally, I would say, write the constitution in Indian languages so that we can discuss with some sense, not getting confused. So ideally, in my lifetime, I would be very happy when we have our Indian constitution, master copy in Indian languages, everything properly democratically approved by all the citizens who read the thing and then vote on it. And then, then we will see, okay, what would be a good thing about secular? Does it make any sense to use it? From my point of view, if we are able to get the three values of the Indian, the French Revolution, what is a good part of the Enlightenment movement, and reinterpret them through the Indic values and get that into the Indian Constitution, I don't see the point of this other thing. What is this secular Laukika? Why not put Laukika if you want? But it is not really the goal of the intent of this whole thing. So yeah, so I think I kind of covered up what I wanted to say for the podcast. Yeah, please go on with the discussion.
Definitely. I think we have discussed the spiritual and the philosophical aspect of secularism and how we should be concerned. I think we were like so immersed with it. So I was like, okay, there are some good, interesting pointers from the audience. But anyways, so Kiran, this is for you. So this is by Sridhar C. So he says that if you followed the spirit of the Latin saeculum, from which the word secular originates, and saeculum is roughly Laukika in Sanskrit, meaning relation to. So is he right, or like, yeah?
I didn't follow the Latin etymology of this. Historically, the word is used in a specific context, and the use in the astronomical context is before, at least from what Wikipedia and some other resources where I followed up, before the general interpretation in politics. And it makes sense. It can also mean the worldly aspect, or I would say Yuga Dharma is a very good translation of this, I would say, because it changes according to each yuga. And in our Dharma Sastras, it's always mentioned that the king has to kind of reinterpret, or the scholars have to reinterpret according to the spirit of the times, Zeitgeist, as the Germans call it. So I think that is but a good point. Yeah.
That's nice. I think we have more questions, but I believe the context of them is in that way that, unless we discuss the practical issues, taking those questions would be kind of offbeat. So we really like the questions, but let us just go with the other part. So we have discussed the philosophy, we have discussed the development. I think since we should have the urge of some swadhyaya for that, let's go ahead and let us understand how secularization happened in India in a deeper way. not just on the thing regarding the Constituent Assembly. So I would kind of give my thesis on that. One thing which Karthikeya very rightly pointed out about the issue of imagined identity, because a nation state is always an imagined identity at the end of the day. That is what a nation state is. That's what nationalism is all about, an imagined identity. And often this conflict comes in, and obviously I don't wish to get into it. Yeah. So one thing is that since we know that the issue of imagined identity comes in, and it's more or less not always true. One thing which my observation, again, it is just my observation, is that the Constituent Assembly tried to amalgamate an identity. But the basic issue with the identity aspect was that, again, this is not about parties or something like that, but when you do not have a good geographical understanding of the circumstances, sometimes your representation and your imagery of that all fails. That's something which happened with, if we read the Constituent Assembly debates. So with this, let us begin with the issue of secularization. We can start with, I don't know, we can start with the empires, or we can start with the British government, or we can start with the Nehruvian era, as the speakers wish to. We'll go in a clockwise manner, so we'll start with Akshay. So Akshay, after listening all of this, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. See, at some level, one could, these were really enlightening interventions and different angles at this whole issue from each of the other three speakers, right? What I want to come back to in some senses and then relate it to each of their interventions is, we started with this thing that how do you ensure harmony in a diverse society, right? That was kind of like the problem statement. And at least my assertion initially was that secularism is one, but not the only approach to it. Secularism is defined by the three characteristics of whatever: neutrality, equality, and liberty. And that came from a root model which was intelligible only in a Christian society and was kind of transplanted here. And hence, one could critique it at both a level of deviation or hypocrisy from stated principles, but also kind of interrogate the principles themselves, right? So I want to actually like explore that a little, because in some ways one could say, hey, how does it matter if it arose in Europe, right? Why does it, so what if it came up in a Christian society? So what if, it was written in English, or, can't we just like find equivalent words here and, we'll be done, right? That's basically what the project is. Like, how does it matter? These are good ideas in any case. So we should adopt good ideas. So how does it matter? So that I have 2 or 3 counters. One is, I actually think to this problem statement of how to ensure harmony in a diverse society, secularism, as defined by those 3 principles, is the inferior solution. And we already had superior solutions in our own civilization. And hence, I mean, it's almost like asking a person who was already using a smartphone to use a feature phone, right? So like, why would you do that? So that's my like first critique. The second, because I mean, it is a fact. See, we weren't a society which was racked with religious conflict during the time of Indic faiths, which anyways had a lot of diversity and all of that within them in any case, right? So it wasn't that there was harmony only because of homogeneity. There was a lot of heterogeneity. There were a lot of different traditions and practices, yet there was harmony. Or at least I'm not saying that it was idyllic, but whatever it was certainly not an area which was racked with religious conflict the way Europe was. So my first point is that why won't you kind of want to anchor and derive at least like lessons from that, seeing the empirical fact that you had far greater religious harmony while still having diversity. So that's point number 1. The second thing that I would say is that the root model or the underlying framework, which I'll just examine, the fact that comes from a Christian context has very real world consequences for intelligibility and implications for why then that framework doesn't sit well in an Indian context, right? And I'll just outline some examples of that. So that's my like kind of second point. And the third assertion that I'll make, which I won't explore in this intervention, but I will in my next, is to say that I would actually make an even more like bolder assertion, which is that the model of secularism that we have in India now, in fact, enhances religious conflict. Far from ensuring religious harmony, far from being just an inferior solution to the problem of religious harmony, that it in fact increases religious conflict, as we know it in India today. And that flows directly from my second point, which is that it is essentially like the underlying framework doesn't sit well with India. So let me just explore a couple of points of the underlying framework to see why it doesn't suit India, right? And why does it matter that it has essentially Christian origins, right? Why can't we just like kind of transplant that superstructure here and use it, right? So let's take two particular points. So for instance, in Christianity, there was this notion of the differentiation between the two kingdoms, the regnum and the sacerdotium, right? So there's a clear separation of like what is the space of secular conduct, what is the space of sacred conduct, right? And the priestly world versus this thing is something that one can like define and delineate. Now that in a John Stuart Mill post-liberal, post-Christian world could also take the form of saying that, okay, here's a private space and here is a public sphere, and follow your religion in your private space and then don't let it impinge upon the public sphere. Now, how one lets it impinge or doesn't impinge, now even within the Christian or post-Christian world, there are differences of opinion on that. So for instance, like in a US or a UK, they will be far more like okay or welcoming of expressions of, let's say, Christianity or religion in general in public life in some shape or form. Still the state doesn't have a religion in a US. In the UK, it technically does. But I'm saying that even in the public sphere, there is no real like allergy to the expressions of religious symbolism or religious conduct in the public sphere. Whereas in France, it is. To the extent that now when France confronts, a post-Christian France confronts a different religion altogether, let's say Islam. Now, then can you really like separate what is the religious versus what is the secular when it comes to a religion like Islam? And I would argue even a religion like Hinduism, right? So can you like, is wearing a burqa a religious act or a secular act? So should you be able to wear it in public or should you only wear it in private? That's a like kind of classic conflict that you're having in a France, right? Should a public official be wearing that or not wearing that? Now, my point is that in an Indian context, this notion of a separation between the religious and the secular, I hear Kiran's point of Laukika, but dharma, I mean, which is badly translated as religion. But the point is that dharma permeates all aspects of our life. We can't really separate out and sever a particular part as this is the realm of dharma and this is the realm which I can kind of like give to the secular world or to the political space. So a lot of the conflicts or even like the debates that we have now are things which are ordinarily a part of culture. When those become a part of public expression, is that the interference or the seeping of religion into public life, or is that really just the expression of culture, right? So when a government office inaugurates a building, if they break a coconut, is that a religious act? Now, what doesn't these questions? I mean, to my mind, that question itself is ill-framed and it is intelligible only in a Christian context. It is not intelligible in either a Hindu and I would say even in an Islamic context. And hence, for the large part, I mean, what we find is that this model of secularism, if we really want to hermetically seal private and public sphere, what we are essentially calling for in many ways is deracination. Because what we are saying is that the public sphere has to be purged of anything that is in any way quote unquote religious. But what is religious versus not is very difficult to define in a Hindu and a Muslim context, and that is like 95% of India, right? So that's my first point, which is that this two kingdoms approach, the regnum versus sacerdotium, this is very much a Christian concept. By the way, it even comes even deeper from Christian metaphysics about the separation between the soul and the body and so on, and that's how the superstructure then was created. And my point is that becomes very difficult to transplant into contexts where religion has a much broader sphere or scope of what it looks at, right? So that's my first kind of like critique. The second one, which I think is important to understand why, I mean, it is so Christian in its orientation is, what is religion itself, right? And what are we calling religion itself? And what was the context in Europe? It was basically to say that there is a universal truth that God has revealed doctrinally on earth. Now, it so happens that there are debates on that. There are debates on what is that truth versus not, right? So different sects of Christianity come about because each of them believe that they have the truth. the state then has, I mean, later on in a post-Christian or in a secular liberal world, had to punt on that, saying that, okay, all of you are saying that you have a claim on the truth. I don't know. I don't want to become a party or a member to this conflict. So let's do this. Separate out private versus public. You follow what you want in private. I am neutral between all of you, right? Again, this is unintelligible in an Indian context. This is still intelligible in an Islamic context, because that is still like a quest for doctrinal truth, right? That you're living your life basis the revealed word of God as the truth, right? But it is not intelligible actually at all in a Hindu context, because Hinduism is a word of, to the extent that that it is anything, it is a personal quest for truth with a bunch of diverse traditions, with no judgment, no superstructure on top of that, which is saying that only some of those traditions are valid paths to the ultimate truth. So truth is not what is revealed at the beginning of a journey, it is what you attain at the end of a personal quest, for which there are many guideposts and many traditions, each of which, none of which is like invalid or not. It is a question of like what you make of it to be able to reach that enlightenment, right? So once again, then the question becomes that when the state is neutral in an Indian context between different religions, and for the sake of convenience, you have classified all of these as religions, you're essentially saying Hinduism is also, like an Islam and a Christianity, one more competing rivalrous universal truth. That Hinduism is making a universal truth claim, so is Christianity, so is Islam. All of them are rivals. I as a state are neutral, right? But Hinduism is not making any universal truth claim. So the question becomes, so why is that important? Because it affects public policy. Because in a context where, let's say, take any other sphere also, where you essentially have rivals of the same kind, things which are the same phenomena, but which are rivalrous with each other, it makes eminent sense to say the state should be neutral. Because, for instance, let's take the free market, right? The government should be a regulator, different companies should compete. But here, you are not an organized search for truth. You're not a cradle faith. You're not something which is. So what you have done, which brings me to assertion number 3, you in fact spark even greater religious conflict, because what you are essentially saying is that Indic traditions and Hinduism should organize themselves as doctrinal faiths, as organized groups, because they have to compete with an Islam and a Christianity, because all of them are competing for a universal truth, which was never the model, the mental model, or the philosophical underpinnings of our religion in the first place, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that this has very real world consequences for how we look at these religions. The last point that I'll make, which comes again, like why is this related to colonialism and decoloniality? So we saw how it is related to Christianity, and obviously Christian as well as post-Christian liberal thought was so underpinned by this whole Christian framework of the separation of, like I said, the two kingdoms, of what religion is. This still governed the post-Christian world's view of looking at religion, right? So when they came to India, they were like, what is your religion? What are your dogmas? What are your doctrines? Who are your priests? Right? So all of these questions make sense only in a Christian context, right? But this is a framework that is kind of like imposed upon India, right? Oh, okay, so your doctrines are this. Your doctrine is the Vedas and the Manusmriti. That is why your society is organized this way. But that's not how like a set of diverse traditions is organized at all. That's the wrong mental model. But my point is, the last point I want to make is, last couple of points. One is that the other real world consequence of this is that when you actually then look at India and look at Hinduism, the one big Christian baggage that remains and is part of the whole colonial and hence the whole project of decoloniality is to say that since religion was universal, this is the root model, right? That religion is universal, it was revealed by God. So then every society on earth, because man came from God, every society on earth should have a religion. So either they have the true religion or they have false religion, because they deviated from the word of God. And because they deviated from the word of God, and they have to be brought back, right? So the underlying model of how a Christian, and to some extent, this baggage carried on in a post-Christian society, is to say that here are a set of practices that I'm encountering that come from false underlying belief, that come from deviant belief. And it is important to reform those deviant beliefs, right? And all practices which are a manifestation of that deviant belief have to be reformed. That baggage in many ways informs how even, I would say, our modern state looks at the faith. It is essentially to say we are riddled with superstition, with caste, with this thing. So devious Brahmin priests tricked the population into like following a set of beliefs which are erroneous. There is a set of core beliefs and accretions that came about which are false. So you have essential practices and false practices, and so you should be able to like reform all these false practices and stick to the core. Now this again is a very, very Christian way of looking at a heathen faith, that there are deviations, that there is a core, that there are texts and there are accretions, and those deviations have to be removed and so on. And why I'm saying that, going beyond the philosophical, why does it matter in the real world? Because in the real world this informs policy. When a court says that you shouldn't be able to sing, when that women shouldn't go to Sabarimala because, or rather they should go to Sabarimala because the underlying thought is one of misogyny, that there is misogyny that has informed, and the priests of that temple are like deliberately, because they're guided by misogyny and this thing, they are kind of like enforcing a practice which is wrong. And now that we know the truth, which is that all people are equal and everyone should have equal access, I will assess your tradition as per my axioms. Now earlier those axioms were Christian axioms, now those axioms are liberal axioms, but the axioms are still held as a litmus test against which tradition has to either pass or fail, right? And then I allow you to either like follow your tradition or not. That's the model in many ways of how we are looking at religion even today in the context of our state. So the points I'm trying to make is that this baggage has real world consequences for how we frame policy, for how the state views Hinduism in particular. So to Ruchi's earlier point, like why did we have a Hindu reformist state and not the others? The other point to note there is that the British essentially saw us as a patchwork of communities amongst whom they have to maintain the peace. So in many ways, it became a question of, and some of that mental model, maybe rightly also, I would say, the Indian state also inherited. So essentially the point was, let's not interfere with this thing because this will disrupt the peace. But I have to reform Hinduism. Right. So let me not reform Islam, because then like God knows will we have another like conflagration in India. But I have to reform Hinduism. Now one can critique it on hypocrisy grounds alone. But my point is that even at a more foundational level, it reveals a certain like attitude towards how the state looks at society, which is as a patchwork of communities amongst whom they have to maintain the peace, and how the state looks at Hinduism, which is essentially a set of traditions stemming from superstition, misogyny, casteism, God knows what else, and and hence we have to like subject it to the laser beam test to make sure that all of those like bad practices are kind of eradicated, right? And that, to my mind, enhances religious conflict in India in many ways, because you have created an impulse for Hinduism to act as a rivalrous faith with universalist claims in some ways, right? And hence having to organize itself. So in many ways, I would say that the direct corollary of the form of secularism that we have in India, secular state that we have in India, is Hindutva. It's the child of secular India, because in many ways, that's exactly what you would expect when you create a model of saying that you have rivalrous faiths which have to compete for universal truth. So that would be my essential submission, which is that we have actually adopted an inferior model of ensuring religious harmony. It is rooted in underlying mental frameworks which are not intelligible outside of a Christian context, and are in fact like deeply divergent from how Indian society and Hindu society in particular looks at life, and that has real world consequences which cause state society conflict and interreligious conflict within India.
That's really interesting. So let's go ahead with Richard. But yeah, before Richard goes ahead, if anybody wishes to give us a follow-up, so no problem. But I think okay, so let's go ahead. So yeah, Richard, you can go ahead with the follow-up.
Yeah, so I'm very glad that Akshay mentioned the colonial assumptions and nature of some of our institutions, because that's exactly the point I was looking to build upon. So if we look at at India from the perspective of the outsider, of the colonizer, and that could be the British colonizer, could be the Turkish colonizer, it could be the Central Asian colonizer. They have always seen India as this area of darkness, that people lived in ignorance, people lived in jahiliya, people lived without civilization, people lived under Oriental despotism. That was the term used by British historians, Oriental despotism. These people are suited only for dictatorship because they're so unruly and so uncivilized that they need this god king like Ashok to civilize them. They need this god king like Akbar to civilize them. And similarly, the British colonialists justified their colonial action, saying that why do you complain about our rule? We've brought justice and equality and Western values to you. We're civilizing you, and you're nothing. You're barbarians. Your whole history has been the Aryans came and civilized you with European genes. The Greeks came and created Indo-Greek kingdoms. The Huns came, the Turks came, the Persians came, the Mughals came. All of these invaders came and civilized you, and now you're semi-civilized, and we're going to finish the job. The French used to say the same about Africa, the mission civilisatrice, so the civilizing mission. And unfortunately, upon independence, we didn't question any of this. We accepted it like, yes, we did live in Jahiliya. We did, we were barbarians. And thanks to British rule, we now have this enlightened class of Western educated lawyers who are going to make our constitution. We have these lovely brown Englishmen in the civil service who will keep everything the way it was in British times. We have this police force that is wonderful at preventing communal tension and preserving harmony. Because you are just a bunch of rival communities who, at the slightest provocation, are prone to violence. And the state's job is not to deliver you justice, not to deliver you outcomes, but to protect itself from your barbaric, savage tendencies. So that explains almost every standard operating procedure of the Indian bureaucracy, judiciary, and police. And what I call this is a continuation of the civilizing mission, but with Nehru, it became, instead of the civilizing mission, the secularizing mission, where he accepted that India is poor, not because of colonialism, not because of structural issues in international trade or diplomacy that's designed to keep poor countries poor. No, we're poor because our culture is inferior, because our religion is inferior. And this is a phenomenon that scholars call self-orientalization or auto-orientalization. And there's a Turkish scholar at Cambridge called Ayşe Zarakol who has written a book about this called After Defeat, How the East Learned to Live with the West. And it's about how Eastern cultures, after a historical trauma, that could be losing a war, it could be a partition, was so demoralized that their elite accepted everything the enemy told them. That the victors told them, as they were leaving, that, you deserved this fate, you deserved to lose, you deserved partition because you were unworthy. If you deserved it, you would have, gotten a better outcome. And so she says, not being Western enough, being behind the West, not being modern enough, not being developed, not being industrialized, not being secular, not being civilized, not being Christian, not being democratic. These descriptions, which other countries use for you, are used to stigmatize post-colonial states or post-defeat states. But when our elites themselves internalize that, it's very detrimental, because now the whole underlying assumption of our state is we're poor because the people are wrong, the people are stupid, the people are backward, and now it's the job of the state to cure them of these savage beliefs. And then once we're Western enough, once we're secular enough, then there's going to be this red carpet rolled out for us by our former colonizers, and they're like, oh, you did it, you became like us, now welcome to the family. That's never going to happen, because these were not good faith arguments told to us for our benefit. They were told to keep us demotivated, demoralized, and dependent on them. So this secularizing mission has manifested itself in the Constitution, in the laws that we have for example, the reformed Hindu personal law, and they provide this semi-colonial state the tools they need to keep people from challenging these assumptions. So they've become codified. And now what do we do about it? There's very little we can do. Because the state is just designed in this way, it works this certain way, and as Akshay said, it doesn't actually prevent conflict, it makes it worse, but it protects the state institutions from the conflict, and that's what matters. The elite, the judges, the bureaucracy have all insulated themselves from these consequences, and if a few people die in riots, because going into the neighborhood would be detrimental to communal harmony for the police, which is just code for the policemen will get lynched if they go there. Then it's not their problem. The poor people, they're uncivilized anyway. They're savage anyway. If they die, they die. That's not a good example of a state that is citizen oriented, and it shows that this top-down project of imposing a constitution based on British laws, and so it's based on the Government of India Act 1935, and then you copy and paste your favorite bits from the French Constitution, the American Constitution, some, the only good bits from the Irish Constitution, but then rejecting the best bits of the Irish Constitution or the Swiss Constitution. And then you've created this Western influenced state, Western influenced constitution that is designed to civilize and secularize the natives, the savage natives. That is a top-down, top-heavy, unsustainable structure that will collapse one day. And all of the state's energies are focused on delaying that collapse. It can't prevent it. It will happen. It's inevitable. But they try to keep it going a bit longer by pretending, by hiding statistics, by refusing to engage constructively with society. And the example of our neighboring states is very instructive, because they too had Western influenced constitutions when they got independence. Pakistan did, Sri Lanka did, Bangladesh did, Nepal was a Hindu monarchy until recently. But let's look at what happened with these other states. And it's very instructive because it shows that a top-down Western imposed set of values, and then expecting that people, the people are stupid because they have to lift themselves to these values that we've set. That's not sustainable. The Constitution needs to reflect the values of the people, not the other way around. We can vote for a new Constitution and replace it. The Constitution can't replace the people by voting for a new people. And this is something that all of our neighbors understood. So Pakistan, when it was formed as a dominion, with Jinnah as the first governor general, it took them a while to create a constitution. They were not an Islamic republic from the start. They became one later once they realized that it's pointless to have a state that doesn't reflect the values of the people. Sri Lanka started off as a dominion, became a republic, and then in 78 declared Buddhism as the state religion as part of its third constitution. Bangladesh, when it declared independence from Pakistan, was initially a secular republic. In the 80s, they declared Islam to be the state religion. And then Nepal, which after their Maoist revolution became secular, still have a better form of secularism than India, because they say secularism in Nepal means the freedom to practice religions, not proselytize. So you have the private right to practice your religion as you see fit, but you can't go around converting people. Now, this is something that never happened in India, that we're still stuck, with this delusion that society achieved perfection in 1951 after the first amendment to the Constitution, or maybe, we achieved perfection during the emergency when, secular and socialist were adopted as aesthetic choices to our Constitution, and now, we're stuck like that and we can never change it. But the alternative to, change is not the status quo. The status quo is never forever. It's constantly changing. If you don't acknowledge that the structure is weak and create a new structure to replace it, it's going to collapse anyway, but you won't be able to control the pace. And that's what's happening. Unless we acknowledge that the Constitution is not a holy book, and that it's not perfection, and society did not achieve perfection back then. That society is changing, public opinion is changing, and public values are changing. We have to make sure that the state keeps up with those changes. Otherwise, the people will move ahead with or without the state's consent. And there are many countries which outright just replace their constitutions. If you can't fix it, they'll burn it to the ground and build a new one. And that can happen through, as Kiran said, by redrafting a fresh constitution, a fresh set of laws in Indian languages, and then putting it up to a referendum to ratify it from the people. That never happened. The original constitution was not ratified by the people. It wasn't even ratified by a fully elected or fully democratic constituent assembly. There was not full voting rights for the people who were framing it. The constitution framers came from the elections during British times when only landowners could vote. So it's very undemocratic. So this is the future, and you forget the West, within the Indian subcontinent, every other country has understood this. Every other country has reformed or replaced its constitution to make it more in line with the values of the people, instead of just worshipping a set of laws and values that are alien to your culture, to your civilization, to your own people. And Kiran said that our constitution is incomprehensible. It is. It's designed to be. It's designed to be so incomprehensible that only a few self-appointed custodians can interpret it, and then filter it down to the people. And that causes so many problems at the grassroots on a day-to-day basis, because people don't understand the constitution, people don't understand the laws that have been passed, and they're dependent on bad faith actors, on journalists, politicians, and lawyers who have conflicting interests when they decide to tell you what the law means. There are so many laws in the last 12 months that have been misinterpreted in the media, simply because people, A, don't have access to the original text of the laws. B, even if they did, it makes no sense because it's written in a way to generate employment for lawyers and journalists.
That's interesting. So I'll get to the Martinian and lawyer. So Karthik, you can definitely go with your pointers. But yeah, pardon the lawyers. So just a joke. So anyways, I think we are reaching to the stage of understanding the practicalities. Richard has very finally made it and made up his points and so forth. So Karthik, what do you think of it? Yeah.
So yeah, well, the lawyers rightfully should get criticized because of the linguistic jargon that our constitution and the interpretation is. So Akshay and Ruchir have explained this very well, and from my side, I don't think no words are necessary nor will suffice what they have explained. I would like to deviate a bit from this the understanding, and they have explained the Hindu fatalism quite well now. So let's see. I would like to talk about how the nature and the characteristic of this nation as a secular state was being presented by the early governments in India, for example Nehru and then Indira Gandhi. And I think in our country, the secular characteristic is more of a token than in practice, which we already discussed. And I think we can see that we tend to make law and policy as the end goal. We regard policy or the law as the end goal and not something which might achieve a goal in the long run. So that is a big issue which we have, and then we see that's how tokenism work in this country. And we can see that when the Somnath temple was being restored by Rajendra Prasad, and Nehru referred it to as an act of Hindu revivalism. So that tells exactly what the problem is with this country, because that gives you two interpretations. One from Rajendra Prasad's side, because India, that is Bharat, which we write in our constitution, we somehow say that India is a continuation of this civilization, which is now have taken a form of a nation state, but it is a evolving state. And in during the Somnath restoration, it was a sign, a symbol that the state is restoring its former glory of the 1,000 years old, slavery. So a lot of people from Rajendra Prasad's side and certain people in the government saw the Somnath restoration as that, but Nehru saw it as an act of Hindu revivalism, and this particular thought of Nehru is very much appreciated in even now in the modern term when the Ram Janmabhoomi Puja happened. So people were like making the contrasting, the making the distinction between how Nehru was and how Modi is now. This gives a very important understanding why people think that a person in office, if he expresses his religiosity or takes part in a religious ritual, somehow undermines the people who are not adherents to this faith. And this is the point which I don't understand, why a person expressing its religiosity is somehow detrimental to other minorities. This has actually been, promoted by this tokenism, that, and this tokenism is quite fake. If you see that, even though you want to do it, you must not do it. So I think this has very much destroyed the right principle of, secularism, that everything should be on the basis of religion, and no religion should be prioritized, or there should be no preferential treatment. But these tokenism has led us to this point where we are having a discussion whether we should be rethinking about secularism. And the third point I would like to add is that this particular responsibility was assumed to be on the Hindu majority. That this is your responsibility to, you adopt secularism so that the other minority should feel good about it. So this is where I think we were forced to do it, to do something which we had that principles, like Akshat explained it. So I think, and I would like to compare with the two colonization of the French colonization and the British colonization. And as in the last episode, we were discussing that how in Anglophone societies, if you speak like them, if you speak English and you act like them, you are integrated. In French colonization, they had this big colonial project of cultural assimilation, and which people everywhere in the colonies were regarded as French, and they used to say "Je suis français," like we are French, and our ancestors were Gaul. Even the French colonies in Algeria and Tunisia also said that. But this was missing in the British colonization because we were subjects. We were not allowed to sing the national anthem, while the French used to sing La Marseillaise. So despite having the law and the policy, we see that till now in France, the French, the people coming from former French colonies have not yet integrated. There's a big assimilation problem in France, despite the law present there. And in England, we see that the Indians or the Pakistanis have very much assimilated to the British culture, and they are part there. So this is something which tells you that if your society accepts something, you don't need a law and policy for that. And I think in India, we had that tendency to assimilate cultures and have a syncretic culture, but still we were forced that no, you are uncivilized and you are extreme. So now it's your responsibility after the partition that you don't become like them, or you make them happy so they do not want to create another Pakistan now. Etc. So that tells you how this tokenism has failed. I have slightly deviated from the issue, but I wanted to talk about how this term is being seen as of now. So that's what I wanted to say.
Great. So, Ruchir, would you like to give a follow-up?
Yeah, could I just add one thing? So, what you mentioned, reminded me of a quote from Martin Luther King, who said that the great stumbling block in our stride towards freedom is the moderate who's more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. And that is the failing of our post-colonial Indian state, of our secularism, that it's focused so much on preventing conflict because it's scared of another direct action day, it's scared of another Mopla rebellion, it's scared of another partition, that it is actually acting in a bigoted way, that it acts as if, oh, minorities are these human landmines. If you step too close on them, they'll explode. And this is called the bigotry of the soft bigotry of low expectations. And there, are many voices, even within the Muslim community, who say this is detrimental to their community as a whole. It might get some privileges for the self-appointed leadership or the clergy of the community, but at the grassroots, the kindest thing you can do to minorities is treat them as equal citizens like anyone else, so that they have, a rising tide can lift all boats. And there was a great article on this topic by Heather Zaki, who says that it's actually, as bigoted, when someone says, oh, oh, Muslims are savage, violent barbarians, and, oh, we need to fix them, as it is when the seculars say, oh yeah, they're dangerous and violent savages, but that's just their culture and we should respect that, and don't challenge them, otherwise it'll happen. Both of those come from a place of bigotry. You're not treating people as individual citizens who have agency, who have their own thoughts, who have their own interests, who have their own incentives. You're just like, oh, they're this blob who are incapable of thinking for themselves, and when Oaisi snaps his fingers, there'll be a riot. Or when Jinnah snaps his fingers, there'll be another partition. That is the trauma from the independence movement that has been internalized by the state, and they actually believe this. No matter how much they say that, oh, we're so secular, or we're so liberal and we care about minority rights, it comes from a place of bigotry. You're still assuming that, oh, minorities are not loyal, that minorities are very violent, and the state is incapable of applying the rule of law there. And that's just to hide our own state's lack of capacity or willingness.
I think we can connect it with directly the domestic considerations. And I think we even discussed it last time in the first episode about why we don't have a strategic vision, whether for domestic policy or for foreign policy. I think it's really connected to that. Yes, so Akshay does have a follow-up. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually have I would say a disagreement of sorts with Ruchir on some things, where I think we come from the same place in terms of what we want to accomplish, but I think the paths to get there will have a difference of opinion. Where I would submit that Ruchir has a more revolutionary approach, and I have a more small c conservative approach to try and get there. And let me explain like why I think that is important. See, I think firstly, I mean, colonization did have both parts, right? It was the occupation of state power, but it was also the in a sense culture, consciousness, and education. In many ways, even that was controlled, right? And hence, consequently, decolonization also has to have both those parts. And what we had was a transfer of power, which accomplishes one, which is to say that, okay, I'm not ruled by the British anymore. But the latter, which is to say that, okay, the normative assumptions, the frameworks, the way of viewing ourselves filtered through this colonial lens, that has to change. Where I say that we need a more evolutionary and hence more small c conservative approach is that I think that the latter is more of a process rather than an event, right? In other words, I mean, to put it in practical terms, I don't think pragmatically we would have actually come up with a radically different constitution by 1950. Not because of anything else, but because we simply didn't have the intellectual ecosystem having developed to that extent where we start to challenge some of those normative assumptions. And in the absence of that, my fear in some ways, as most conservators would fear, is that any revolutionary action would actually potentially lead to more disruption rather than not. So in some ways, I am the pragmatist that Martin Luther King is actually criticizing, in that I do see, like, as a moderate or as a pragmatist or as a small c conservative, I do have, like, what keeps me up at night is much more that things can go horribly wrong than that they will that we needed to go right now. And at that, as long for me, the critique is not so much. I think firstly, the Indian state was a great accomplishment. It was a great thing that our civilization finally had a unified state of sorts, right? Not for our entire territory, but that our civilization, after a really long time, had a state which could be an agent of modernity. I think it is something for us to cherish while we critique it. My only critique is that over time we needed to, through slow prudence and soft degrees, keep incrementally changing that, such that at any given point in time we still have a stable society, but that we are anchoring this much more in our philosophy, our normative models, our values, and our society in many ways. So I see that as a continuous and incremental process, as opposed to an event, right, after which we would have been like fine. I just don't think that we had the wherewithal at that stage, and that is a consequence of like the historical. I mean, history is path dependent, right? So the historical path that we followed was that we had been colonized, and large parts of India had been colonized for centuries, right? Or and so we simply didn't have the, even internally, we didn't have the language of politics. We didn't have a deep enough engagement with politics about what a state should be, what that engagement should be, for us to have come up with something which is like which would have been sound. Maybe we would have come up with something, but we don't know whether it would have lasted. And the history of many post-colonial states says that many have also failed, right? Many have failed miserably. So in that sense, I think there was like maybe over caution, but there was some sense of pragmatism, I think, in kind of almost conserving and extending the British Raj as the Indian state. There is a case, there is some merit in that. I think the bigger critique for us has to be that after that, what is it that we did with that, right? What is it that as a society and in politics that we did to inject ideas into the public discourse, which then would cause that decoloniality in discourse, which then translates to decoloniality in policy and politics, in state structure eventually, right? And I think we struggle with that, because even now, if you see that a lot of our critique of policy is largely tactical and reactive, right? So it'll be like one off. It'll be like, we should have a uniform civil code. Oh, you know what? We should have a like Ram Mandir is actually not a bigoted idea. It is actually just reclaiming what is this. So you see like these, but the underlying like philosophical framework to even talk about this in the form of saying that, okay, this is a process of decolonization. These are the normative assumptions that undergird how we have architected our state structure today. Hence, these are the parts that we should interrogate, right? And hence, public policy should change in ABCD reasons. I think this we are just like starting to do that now, and I think hence the approach that we should take should be somewhat like conservative, slow, and measured in doing that, so that we don't lose what we have, which was already like a very big advance. As much as we critique it, it was a big advance, right? Which is that our civilization finally had its own state.
That's really interesting. Before we go to Kiran, just a point to add, since I wish to. I think to summarize what Akshay said, I think we can take one simplest of examples that happened months before. So often people ask, and again, this is just an analogy. So people say, okay, fine. When it comes to comparing between Kamala Harris and Tulsi Gabbard, people choose Tulsi Gabbard, not Kamala Harris. Why they do is because of the kind of things which Tulsi Gabbard represents. So I think we very well understand why we need to see. And I think Akshay made a very comforting point on that. So let's go to Kiran. Yes, Kiran.
Yeah, actually, very interesting points. How this context of secularism evolved over history, how it's changing over time, and how it's never static. We cannot just treat it as a stone. I also agree with Akshay that this evolutionary way of looking at incremental change and ultimately achieving an ideal is the right Indic way also, because we don't actually dramatically expect that happily ever after kingdom of God would come in the next couple of hours or something. That is not realistic. And the process of decolonization, Professor Kapil Kapoor in one of his talks mentioned that it actually started in a very, very slow way. Raja Ram Mohan Rai, for example, is a fairly colonized mind, but he kick-started something. And then Dayanand Saraswati, and then Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Vivekananda, Aurobindo, and many thinkers, Tagore as well, they actually added different aspects to it, and it's still ongoing. So we should also realize that it will take time, a long time, to rediscover the Swadhyaya, to rediscover the things. So I would like to just point out one aspect which is secular as it is interpreted today, and its specific expectations and specific impositions on Hinduism. Because basically, when we ask internally, like within Indic context, what are you? What is your religion? It doesn't make any sense. We don't have equivalents for that. Hinduism still is basically a catch-all miscellaneous basket that is put and kind of reinterpreted in some way. So it's actually, when we say secularism and by its extent Hinduism is being used, the question is really if you are still following that, it is whether we as Indian citizens, we as people who basically live and breathe with this thing, do we have an independent voice to express what we are? Or are we just following what somebody else said and grouped us into some category? And the thing is, this categorization and imposition of this identity and this whole knowledge base around it, it's a long process in colonialism. It started already immediately after the British occupation. And serious scholars basically did a lot of work to mess around with our texts and completely distorted and really just absurdly kind of created a whole dogma of this whole thing. And these texts are still being cited. They have never been decolonized. Britain has never been decolonized. They are still like, holy grail that has been followed by all follow-up researchers. So we have the great Monier Williams, and he wrote about Hinduism and Brahmanism. It's just complete rubbish, but it's still, the ideas still percolate in many waves through these things. So when we say, when we kind of protest against it, that this is wrong, this is absurd, it doesn't make any sense, then it actually is like we are arguing against secularism. Essentially, this is how it is being framed. So in my first section, I just said what secularism is. Should we kind of accept it or not? But right now, in the context, when we anything we say which is a bit authentic of our own identity, our own understanding of what our texts are, what our culture is, it is being said that it is anti-secular. It's because actually we are critiquing the construct of Hinduism and a construct of India. It's a colonial construct, and it's inevitable that we do that because it's not real. So at some point, this has to be exposed, and it has to be slowly kind of dug, and the whole thing exposed to sunshine, and just the whole crap just removed. It's not just in our constitution, in academia, in very influential academic texts, in universities, in media, in popular culture, Temple of Doom all over the place, this kind of a thing. We need to face, realize our own voice and kind of slowly start working on that. And it's inevitable, we will do that. What I want to say is that what actually in reality today in India, when people say secular, essentially it's a carte blanche to Monier Williams, and that is truth. Essentially, that is what is secular meaning to come. And essentially what that means is that whatever biases, whatever prejudices, whatever just desires to loot, whatever these people have, they are justified, and we cannot argue against that. And it's also why people get annoyed, because it's Hindus get annoyed. Muslims also had their own deorientalization project, and they got they did a bit further ahead against this thing. But essentially, it is our way of battling around some kind of a circle of construct imposed on us. It doesn't make any sense. Now, just to conclude, where do we see this going? What can we really realistically achieve towards this, and by this process still protect and preserve whatever good that is remaining in our culture and society, and not just have some really intelligent thinking judge to reinterpret everything and do the job that Monier Williams or whoever else hasn't finished. So how do we stop this, and how do we kind of slowly regrow the forest, what we authentic sacred forest that is there in India? So my point is that at some point we still have to have the goal that this cannot be the British text. The constitution has to be changed. It has to be an Indian text, Indian languages, Indian authentic terminology. And that needs to be the goal at some point to get there. And what that should be and how we will get there is open to question and may take time. I just want to say that we have our tradition of dharmasastras and in Indic culture. Like if you didn't have any of this colonial history and any of this other thing, if you just ask Indians, let's say they didn't have this colonization and they went on for another 300, 400 years, and they gradually in an objective way looked at Europe and Britain and US and saw what's happening, like a disinterested, compassionate aliens just looking at things and then taking the good and improving their own society. Indians would naturally build their own authentic constitution, and that would have a certain thing, certain framework, certain structure, and we need to discover what that is. And from my point of view, I would say that we would have layered constitutions and layered interpretation. It's not just one big text bloated with entropy, with all over the place, everything randomly put together by some completely illegitimate constituent assembly, not at all voted by the Indian citizens. It would rather have a layered order. The American Constitution is a great example. It's very compact, very, very tiny, but then bloated in other ways. But in India, we have the tradition of sutra. So that is basically like Occam's razor, right? It's just very precise. And we need to have something like the sutras, like the key principles, and then something like the bhashya, which would be like elaboration of what that means, and that is actually distinguished between different types of interpretation. We cannot have unique things that go for all. We need to allow for divergence of opinion here, and that is the goal of darshana. We had darshana in India. We never had religion. So darshana is a point of view. We need many points of view, and then we kind of get a holistic whole. It cannot be compressed in text. So we need to have bhashyas. Fine. Then we will have the great lawyers, talking to each other and doing the thing. Is it finished? No. We are a democracy. We need to have this percolated all over the citizens. We need to have jury duty for citizens, and kind of they need to understand what these things are and kind of argue. And we need to educate the citizens like that. And the traditional way in India we did that is through stories. We had Itihasa, we had Purana, we had great cultural art forms, and let's use technology, let's use whatever things are possible. We need to build that bridge that kind of democratizes this knowledge. Until all this is done, right, we are not, honestly speaking, a democracy. We are just a land of subjects, still enthralled to the Queen Elizabeth through our system apparatus, through our jurisprudence, through random crap in academia and media. So at some point we need to get over that. I know it's like it's almost 100 years now with the independence, right? So at some point we need to realize that, oh yeah, actually this is a game. It is a stupid game. In fact, it doesn't make any sense. But let's just keep playing the game, because otherwise we will get chaos, and chaos is not what we want. We need to rediscover ourselves. So we need to give that span of time so that some good philosophically mature and also like intelligent discourse germinates in India. And also we have a responsibility for that. We need to be authentic for ourselves. We have a responsibility also for the world. So at some point, we need to give that space. And I really hope that the judges and the politicians and the media just don't destroy that opportunity, because at some point things can grow, but if they're killing everything, then like what is it's like a disaster, right? So I think that is my point on this this thing. So I'll just stop here.
No problem. I mean, it's like a hymn. So we're like just listening it, listening it, listening it. So I think, okay. Yeah, yes, Richard, please.
So I think what Akshay and Kiran said make a lot of sense, and especially the fact that in 1950 it was very unlikely we would have gotten a different constitution unless we were born as some sort of revolutionary state through violence. Like, if Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose had come all the way to Delhi and established it, then we would have seen a radically different one. But the way in which the power transfer took place meant that it was a handover from one set of elites to another. So I don't think it would have been any different in 1947 to 1950. I think the unfortunate thing is the rest of the world went through two phases of massive constitutional reform. One was in the 70s, when in post-colonial countries, one generation after the initial independence, people were frustrated that it was a false independence. They were still living in poverty, still living in demoralization and dependence, and they demanded something different. Even in India, we had that moment. So, for example, when we had Sampurna Kranti, or we had Navnirman, or even in 1977, the Janata Party came to power. They came to power promising to remove secular and socialists from the constitution, to undo all of the distortions that were brought in through the emergency. In fact, the Janata Party was so radical by today's standards that they even put in a request, along with Sri Lanka, to rename the Red Cross to the Red Swastik in India and Sri Lanka. That's how, that's not even imaginable today. But they put in that request. They were rejected, but, the Janata Party, despite winning massively in the post-emergency elections in 77, did not succeed in changing the constitution, because the constitution is so designed to prevent that sort of change. Because it didn't matter if you won a huge majority in the Lok Sabha elections, the Rajya Sabha was there to block it, and it was full of 30 years of Congress legacy, who blocked any sort of change. Plus, the judiciary, with their basic structure doctrine, have made it incredibly difficult to change whatever they have now invented. They declare whatever they want through judgments, that, oh, now this is considered basic structure, even if it was added in 1992, like the Places of Worship Act. That was added, out of panic by the Narasimha Rao government during the Babri Masjid demolition. But now that's considered basic structure because of a judgment. It can't be repealed. It can't be changed. That's a big problem. So we have this super conservative constitution. They keep saying the constitution is a living, breathing document. It's a revolutionary document that empowers people. Not anymore. Since the basic structure document is set in stone, that's why I take a more accelerationist position, that the solution is to do what the second phase of constitutional reform in the rest of the world did, and that was in the 90s. From 1989 to 1995, countries that emerged out of a post-socialist transition in Central and Eastern Europe, or even in Asia, in China or in Vietnam, did engage in reforms to adapt to the new geopolitical and economic realities of the 90s. And they got new constitutions. They purged their politics and academia of people whose hands were dirty from the previous, let's say, regime or administration. And in the 90s, we embarked on economic reform because the IMF put a gun to our head. But we didn't use that opportunity to engage in the same political reforms that went hand in hand with these economic reforms in the rest of the world. So now we are enjoying the benefits of liberalization and globalization over the past 30 years, but with a structure and a set of mechanisms in the government that are not suited to it. They're suited to the feudalism, that passed off as socialism during Nehruvian and Indira Gandhi's time. So, as a result, when I say the inevitable collapse of the state, it's not necessarily through a revolution. It's more that that's the consequence of not acting. If we don't embark on reform seriously now, political reforms, judicial reforms, administrative bureaucratic reforms, then it will still collapse, but in a way that will result in chaos and will not be optimal for society. And that's the bad scenario. So it's not that I would endorse that sort of collapse or revolution, but from a realistic perspective, that is the alternative to not acting. Not acting won't preserve this state for another 70 years. It's just a tiny aberration in the long march of history.
I have a point of view.
Sure.
Yeah, I think just in response to Ruchir, I mean, I agree. I don't think inaction is an option, right? Because inaction will lead to collapse. I just think that my point is on the preconditions for change to be positive while still being stable. And to my mind, the precondition for change to be positive while still being stable is an intellectual ecosystem which is able to then throw up ideas which are then debated, critiqued, and are also rooted and anchored in the Indian tradition. So they should be anchored, they should be rooted, but they should, I mean, there should be a lot of debate. And to Kiran's point on like darshanas, there should be like a lot of different perspectives, because we haven't, it's just a fact that we haven't as a society, as a colonized society, we didn't have to engage on many aspects of political and state structure. So we don't have the language in many ways to deal with that, or at least in any measurable form. So we can go back to Chanakya, we can go back to this thing, and I'm sure there's a lot of wealth of information there. But the fact of the matter is, for us to address the questions of today, we have to build on that. So it has to be rooted in our values, it has to be rooted in our culture, it has to be rooted in our mental models of how we view the world. But there's a lot of work to go from that to theory, which then translates to practice. And unless we have that, the enthusiasm for change and the kind of the sense of disquiet, very legitimately, that we may have with the status quo, my fear is that may translate to change which is revolutionary but which is unsustainable. So let's also look at the emergency itself. 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, which came about during the emergency, was a massive change in the Constitution. I mean, in legal circles, it's even called as the second Constitution in some ways, right? Because it was that wide-ranging in its scope. It changed everything from center-state relationship to this thing. So there was like a wide-ranging like set of things that it did change. Now, looking back, many of us would argue, rightly or wrongly, that was changed for the worse. And in many ways, I mean, it came from the same revolutionary impulse of an impatient, centralized authority thinking that there were too many checks and balances on being able to move quickly. And what was required was the union government to be much more empowered to make like wholesale changes to usher in the new era, right? So we've also had our share of revolutionary enthusiasm without the underpinnings of an intellectual ecosystem where to actually throw up the right ideas which are rooted but also well developed on top of that, and have built that superstructure on top of our values to come to something which is practical in the real world and hence realizable. It is hence not a coincidence actually that on the areas where we have the most, I would say, tangible policy aspects are things which are directly cultural, right? Which are like Ram Janmabhoomi, Uniform Civil Code, 370. These are the sorts of things which are like this one. But now, if you want to have like a debate about like what's the role of the union government versus state governments, what should be the role of the state in the economy? Now, should it be rooted in Indian values? Absolutely, because that's when it will sustain, right? Do we yet have a developed theory which then derives from like our Indian thought, but at the same time taking the best of the rest of the world and adapting it to our context? Not yet. So it is no wonder that we have only a debate between different derivative ideas, right? Should we be socialist? Should we be neoliberal? I'm just talking of the economy now, right? And so on in every field, because we haven't yet developed that. So to my mind, I mean, the urgent and important point, and there's no shortcut to this, is the revival of Indian knowledge systems, is the building of is the reorientation of fields like the humanities, of law, of other things, such that they are able to connect the dots to Indian knowledge systems. They do derive from that, and we build a far more vibrant intellectual ecosystem which has all those ideas. And from there will naturally be, through the democratic process then and through like public policy making in general, we will influence and reshape our state and our policies and our But without that base, we will always be having a debate between different intellectually derivative ideas, none of which by themselves will sustain.
I would like to have a comment here, because we have been discussing about the emergency, and that is a very dramatic change in the constitution. The secular as a word has been added there, and I think we should look at it in the overall geopolitical context, because India right now cannot change things by itself. We need to also think of our geopolitical context, what type of stability in commerce, in trade, in technology, in what we have, what can we really, honestly speaking, implement. Otherwise, we will have trouble. And it's a geopolitical thing. And Indira Gandhi at that time had a unique geopolitical problem, because she kind of reshaped the map. Whatever balance of powers that was there between the United States, China, and Russia, they just got completely messed up. And naturally, she had a lot of heat for that. So once Bangladesh was separated, it's inevitable at that point that Indira Gandhi would get heat. Part of that is domestic, part of that is definitely foreign influence. So at some point, that heat would get to such a high temperature that, yeah, she needed to survive. She wanted to just survive as a woman, as a prime minister, and also as a country. India is Indira, right? That's what they said. So basically, in order for the survival to happen, she kind of found whatever things are possible to sneak in. And one way to sneak in is to distinguish and differentiate India from Britain. And that, I think, is the key reason why she sneaked in socialist and secular into that thing, because Britain is not socialist, Britain is not secular. It's definitely de facto out of Britain. And if Indira had a way, I think she would have put Soviet as well, because she didn't understand what Soviet meant. She didn't put it. But otherwise, it would have been a very clear statement that, okay, I am not part of this Britain crap, and I would be basically supported by my friends, maybe the Russians or whoever. She's just trying to survive. It's a very stupid way to insert, such dramatic changes into the constitution, and a very unstable situation. A lot of water has flown afterwards, and we have a lot of nonsense being said today, and we need to kind of find a way where we slowly get back to sense and kind of have a argument which is based on facts, which is based on samvada, where we discuss with each other with respect, different types of perspectives, and all this in a democratic manner, and also archived somewhere. So what the Constituent Assembly didn't do needs to be done now. Basically, a democratic process where all these things come together and weighed and interpreted and reviewed, and then in slow time, we will get to the like some process to this, and we can take advantage of technology for that, right? Right now we are talking over video, not possible in the Constituent Assembly time. And similarly, there's a lot of technology like virtual reality, artificial intelligence for the analysis of images and video, audio, and ultimately, the whole jurisprudence can also be automated. Like part of that can be automated. So we need to have a view towards the future, make the best use of technology, also evolving technology, and develop technology in India with the goal that it will be used like this. It would be great if I just could speak in Telugu today, right? Couldn't do that. Because obviously some of you probably are speaking, but others couldn't. And we unfortunately have English as the imposed national language. So we are forced to conduct this discussion in English. Why not use technology to automatically, bring various languages together, have process of interpretation where this can be all be done, and conduct it in Indian soil, in Indian legitimized, government legitimized soil, where we build institutions which are future oriented for a long term, where such discussions can happen, and not just between hand-picked experts, but anybody can take part in. We have the technology to enable that, and also to summarize all these things. And ultimately, what Akshay said, what is missing, this knowledge system and this interpretation to law, to politics. Yeah, we will get there. As essentially, we need to allow for that, and we need to build that. And what I'm basically worried about is, again, coming back to geopolitics, because Indira had a problem. If Indira didn't have Bangladesh on her head, India would not have been like this. I think secular wouldn't have appeared in the constitution. So Indira had a problem, and that problem was not just limited to India. It was a gigantic mess in many, many places. So we need to empower people to prevent such mess from spilling over into our country, because that is happening all the time. So we are not responsible for it, but we have to take up the crap. So essentially, we need to have a strategic vision to kind of hold fort and protect our peace of mind, basically, so that whatever things we build would be something authentic to our society and not just imposed at the turn of the society. Some random event. China war with US, who knows, can happen, right? So how do we kind of deal with these kinds of things? And so the army needs to be part of this, and the government needs to have a specific strategic vision to kind of nurture these types of things. In the US, they will just give it all to Harvard University. They will do that thing, and they will just sneak it through some lobbying into their government apparatus. Do we want to do that? It's a pretty stupid and primitive way to do that. I would rather want to use the best technology we have, and then just stop paying lip service and actually implement the democratic ideas, whatever we want. And I would say just do the constituent assembly correctly. Democratic, a billion people with all the wisdom and everything slowly integrated, and at some point refined, and we would have scholars. You would have great thinkers that would germinate at some point, but we need to give space for them, right? So I would say that if we use whatever opportunities we have, either as a state, either as private foundations, or either as some apparatus of something which has a strategic vision, right? Not just a turn of politics, like 5 years, government gone, somebody else would show up. No, we need to have a strategic vision that needs to be nurtured in some way and can be protected and from sabotage, because you will be sabotaged for sure. So essentially, we need to think of how we kind of convince our friends, our allies in the international sense, to kind of give us the space for doing this, and ourselves be smart enough to defend this activity for some amount of time. Because what I just get annoyed these days is every idiot wants to have a revolution in India, and they don't understand what they want to get. Essentially, like what? Yeah, haven't we seen enough? And it's so this kind of abuse of AI, abuse of our disadvantaged colonial situation. Needs to be somehow barricaded, and some kind of a free space for thought, for independent thinking, and democratic discussion needs to be provided, and ideally in our own languages. That would be my wish. Yeah.
Great. So I believe now we should go ahead with the conclusion. The reason is that I was thinking to go with the 3 to 4 phases, but I think the second part has actually engulfed the rest of the phases enough. So let's go with the conclusion. But before we go to the conclusion, I would like to give up some important aspects since we have discussed. Now, one thing which all of us pointed out about, and I think where I was very much intrigued by what Akshay said to Richard about the revolutionary versus policy conservatism approach. One thing we need to understand is, I think, there was one thing which Richard mentioned, which was the basic structure doctrine. Now, one of the important issues with this basic structure doctrine is, and I think a little bit I wish to emphasize on that, is because the basic structure doctrine has an inherent problem. Now, as we know that aesthetics is very much copied, we are not clear about the political purpose as well as the legal purpose. So what happens is, okay, fine. The basic structure was needed at that time because it was getting too much outreach. Because the funnier part is that not just Nani Palkiwala, but also Fali Nariman was one of the advocates who actually went against the government under Indira Gandhi and said, no, have a basic structure to protect it. Now, the funniest part is that I read remarks from retired Supreme Court judges who say, okay, fine, anything you can just have basic structure and all that. But I think that has also to do with the openness of the collegium system and the judiciary. I'm not going to comment on that much. But still, I think the problem with the basic structure, I think, in the future will come when we need to say, okay, fine, you wish to have amendments, but then are you going to include issues like emotions into it? Because even I've heard this funny form of again, I've heard of it. I'm not saying I'm claiming it. I've heard of it. There's a funny form of claiming where people are saying include emotions into law or international law. That is something which has also been incorporated. Now the purpose is not clear, but how can you have an emotions and law or emotions and international legal approach? It means that, okay, fine, the ICJ will say, oh, no, 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 it is like Nicaragua versus US. We are, US is more emphatic, let's take the US. It's not going to work like that, right? So I think we need to try to decentralize that, and I very well agree with all the panelists on this point that we should have a balanced approach. At the same time, try to incrementalize it, see what is your vision in 10 years, 20 years, what you're going to do. I think one inflection point in foreign policy, which will be there for even in secularism for that matter, is the Indo-US ties. The second one, which I believe is very integral, is the Indo-Iranian ties. But I believe more the Indo-US ties, because we are too much having this bonhomie with the US. But how far will it go? It depends. So we need to see. I mean, just recently we heard this news that the US Congress approved the stimulus, right, for the American people, and that those stimuluses are now benefiting Chinese businesses. So we very well know that this is an America-centric order, and I think, again, I know that I deviated a bit, but point is that we understand it. Even secularization comes with when it comes to religious freedoms. So let's go for the concluding points, and I'll go in a clockwise manner. So Akshay, how would you like to conclude? Yeah.
Yeah. So I will just conclude by kind of summarizing some of my major assertions and then kind of laying out what I think are the implications for that. So to kind of summarize, I mean, my point is that I think the key problem statement is, and I think a shared objective that all of us would have is that how do we maintain harmony in a diverse society? I think we will be a diverse society and we will want to maintain harmony. I think that's very important for us. In that, I think that we have adopted a suboptimal approach of a particular form of secularism, which is essentially one which is rooted in certain mental models of separation of public and private sphere and of viewing religion as competing rival claims for universal truth, right? Now, by itself, I mean, one can say that this is abstract philosophy, so why does one care? But it actually, this underlying mental model translates to practical policy in terms of how the state views, in particular, the Hindu religion. So, for instance, like reforming it and to purge it of all traditions which don't conform to liberal principles in some ways, on the one hand. Second is to kind of maintain the peace between warring groups of religions by kind of like being like this umpire, and hence treading very gingerly about trying to extend the sovereignty of the state in order to frame law and then enforce law basis viewing all of us as citizens, equal citizens, as opposed to members of these warring groups, right? And hence you kind of have to have this peace treaty of, you give somebody this concession and somebody else this concession. I think that's the second thing. And third, this I think this underlying mental model creates an impulse in society for actually greater conflict. Greater conflict, both because the hypocrisy is evident, but also because the underlying foundational elements of this mental model don't sit well with India at all. And hence, on a day-to-day basis, we always have a conflict between what is the secularism and what does that mean for how our traditions manifest in public life and how we deal with each other. So it actually fails finally on its most consequential test, which is that is it able to maintain religious harmony? And I think especially if you evaluate it against the light of India having been a successful society of having maintained both diversity and harmony in our past, I think it's a huge opportunity missed that we actually have adopted, to my mind, an inferior model by kind of taking some of these normative assumptions which are not rooted in us. So it's not just that these are not rooted in our philosophy. That by itself, I mean, I'm fine with. So many things are not rooted in our philosophy, right? Like macroeconomics might not be rooted in our philosophy. But the point is that this has real world consequences which are negative and will go away from what we ourselves successfully accomplished in the past. Now, how do we change that? To my mind, I mean, the starting point. I mean, it won't happen in a neat sequence. But I'm just saying that the base for that is really going to be to create the intellectual ecosystem, the language for us to be able to engage on modern political topics, but with a deep revival of our own knowledge systems. And when we do both, which is that we engage with modernity, but we synthesize that with a lot of our own rooted thought, that's when we will come up with solutions. We will come up with an alternative imagination to solve many issues which are decolonized in the way that we view it. And one such important issue will be the issue of how to maintain harmony in a diverse society, right? But it will go even beyond that, and we will kind of reimagine our state, our policies, our projects, our entire this thing. But it'll start with a much more intellectually diverse ecosystem, but also a rooted ecosystem. So that's kind of like my final submission.
Great, Richard. Yeah.
I think all of the panelists brought up really important points, and I think to me the ones that stood out are that decolonization and democratization go together. At the moment, we're still a semi-colony. At the moment, we're still a semi-democracy, and it's very important. So, for example, what Akshay said about reclaiming and restoring our native knowledge systems, that's a part of decolonizing hearts, minds, and institutions. For example, since independence, the Indian government, the archives have collected millions of texts from ancient times, of chronicles, of untranslated, unprocessed texts, which are just gathering dust. This should be a top priority. The problem is we don't even know what we don't know. Chanakya's Arthashastra was only rediscovered in the 1920s. There could be a treasure trove of so many important texts that we have to access in order to understand ourselves, to understand our society, the past, present, and future. And it is with that basis that we can create a more democratic form of state, which truly reflects the values of its citizens, instead of seeing us as subjects or as members of warring tribes. And there's a lot to learn from other countries, beyond just the West. That in the 50s, because the only examples of sovereign countries were in the West, we copied our constitution from there. But there are examples of countries that were never colonized. So Japan, Thailand, Iran, Ethiopia were never colonized, and they've created modern nation states that, and in Iran's case, even a civilizational state that reflect their civilizational and popular values. Or if we look at Southeast Asia in general, look at ASEAN, what is the common factor among the ASEAN states? It's Lee Kuan Yew's Asian values, where he talks about abstract values like human rights or secularism. They only exist when the state has enough sovereignty and capacity to enforce them. It's not enough to adopt them as an aesthetic choice, and then maybe 5,000 rich people can role play as, oh yes, we're so westernized because we have a secular constitution, when at the grassroots it doesn't actually translate to anything positive for people on the ground. It doesn't fill the bellies of the poor. It doesn't prevent people from violence by the state or from violent groups. And these are failings that we need to address, that if we want to be a society that cares for its citizens, and not just a state that's still obsessed with civilizing the savages or secularizing these backward belief systems, then these are gaps that need to be filled one way or another.
That's interesting. Yes, Karthikeya. Yeah, correct.
So this discussion has been really enlightening, and I agree with all the panelists on majority of the issues. Conclude this, I would like to say that the society is not, the law is for the society, and the society is not for the law. So, and the society makes state. So by making, just depending on the law, we cannot imagine a society to reach the end goal we want it to be. So it needs, in present India, if we are talking about secularism, we need this dialogue which we are having right now. Views should be a part of academia, of major state machinery. And as Ruchir said, that decolonization of hearts and mind is the first step towards this goal. And I believe that we need reforms in every sector, for example, the state machinery of maintaining law and order and keeping order in the among the heathens, the police, and then civil service, which are too reluctant and have become a Gordian knot that cannot be, untied now. So we need structural reforms in this area, and then we have to uh, challenge the hegemony of academics who have controlled Indian academics for so long.
Great.
If you
Okay,
have a
so sorry.
sorry, if you have a contrary view, you won't get a permanent, tenure or something. So we need to challenge those hegemony in every sector. And the best analogy is Article 370 of how Indian government had done that. Congress has diluted it since the past decades, and BJP did that in one go. So this is the perfect analogy of how we can solve our problems by gradually, salami slicing, as the Chinese have adopted it, and then to make society to a stage where major reforms can take place. So I think it's one step forward at a time, and then we can reach our goal, our the goal we want India to be.
Great. Yes, Kiran, please. Yeah.
Yeah, also I think the discussion had many interesting points, very enlightening to look at all these things. For me, I think what would be a good take home point, and what we should aim for is we need to slowly build a strategy where we can actually have an authentic expression of ideals. So I said the equivalents of liberté, égalité, fraternité, I thought would be this Swadhyaya Shakti, and then instead of equality, we would actually have Bhadra Sanmana, the respect aspect. And then for fraternity, we need to incorporate every aspect of life, and we have some kind of a yoga kshema. So these ideals, we need to discuss. We need to take time. We need to discuss in our own languages. So we need to train ourselves to rediscover our own mother tongues and express all aspects through that. And that needs to be done naturally in a sadgoshti, in a round table, where we take advantage of technology through various tools. So where is the online platform for Samvada in India? Who will build it? Okay, how can we build it? So these are the type of questions we need to think of it in an incremental way, so that at some point we will be wise enough and we will be clear enough how to get to the goals. Because this is an open-ended process. It will take a long time. And I don't want to categorize people into boxes. Hindus, Muslims, Jains, doesn't matter. Who are you to categorize me? You can choose each person as a right for all these ideals. And we need to give that free space so that they can come forward and honestly and freely express these things, and so that we'll all learn from each other, right? So this is a good goal, and I don't think we will get any opposition from any specific Indian. If they're truly Indian, they will never oppose it. Only foreigners who might want to exploit us for some reason might want to poke this way or that to kind of do crap. But authentically Indians, we can actually live together happily and harmoniously together. So for that, we need to be authentic. So let's train ourselves to be authentic. Let's make use of technology for that. That's, I think, my takeaway, a concluding point for this debate.
Great. So we come to a very nice conclusion. Honestly, I would have taken it more, but I think Richard's prediction came right. So anyways, we then conclude this discussion. We will come up with a new episode of In This Thing in some time. We wish happy Holi to all. And let's see how this goes. So we have been discussing decoloniality. We might discuss it more in the next episode, or maybe more. We don't know. But how it goes, it depends. So I thank Akshay, I thank Ruchir, I thank Kiran, and of course Kartike for coming for this discussion. Maybe have more in future, and maybe on some more diverse issues. So thank you so much. Here we end with the discussion. So also thanks to the audience, the vibrant audience which asked questions. We tried to take the best questions as possible wherever we felt it there were the questions. For anything else, I mean, we will have discussions. So yes, please do participate and ask questions to our panelists. We would be more than happy to take them. So I thank everyone for being a part of the discussion. And again, namaste.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.